What's going on, guys? Tosker here, and in this video we're going to cover multiple ways that we can do validation in WPF. Now, unlike my other videos, because we're covering multiple ways, over here I've already created some projects and we're going to go through them together. Now, for our first part, you'll notice that I already have an observable object and a view model and a basic layout. If you'd like to follow along, there's actually a project on my GitHub. If you want to follow along, just go to this link. You can clone or download. I recommend downloading this zip, and then you can unzip it and then open it in Visual Studio. And in here you're going to see all the projects that we're going to cover in the video. But then I also have a fourth project here which has the basic template of what we're going to be working with, and then you can use this project to follow along. So what I mean by data validation is, for example, we have our text box here, and when we enter in, let's say we want to do a registration form and we're entering in a username. Now, this username may have a requirement of, let's say, at least 5 characters, and we want the text box to perhaps highlight in red or show an error message if the current username that is inputted is not valid. Now, over here in our project, for our first one, we're actually going to do this by throwing an exception. So we're going to go to our registration view model, and the only thing we're really going to do here is over in our setter for our property, we're going to create an if statement. So if string is null or white space, we're going to give it the value, and if this is true, then we're just going to throw a new argument exception, and we're going to say the username cannot be empty. So to begin, all we're going to do is we just can't have an empty username. Now, using exceptions for validation is very convenient, but it's not always an appropriate way to do it. An example of when we would maybe not want to use this is if a common invalid state can be abstracted. So if we're having minimum characters and we're also going to have other fields with minimum characters, we may not want to do this to each and every property. It may also require a combination of values, not just this one property. But moving on, over here we're going to go back to our main window, and we're going to go down to our XAML. And then the first thing we want to do, of course, is go to our text box, and we want to bind to the text property here, binding. And we're going to bind, of course, to the username that we created. And before we do anything else, I just want to run the application. So now with our application running, we can see as we type, nothing really happens. And then when we erase, nothing really happens. But then, of course, to update the property, we want to change controls, so I'll click the button. Now, the button doesn't really do anything. This is just updating because now I've switched the focus. But we see here it's going to throw an exception. Now, if it throws an exception for you, you want to go down here to Exception Settings, and then untick Break when this exception type is user unhandled. And then click Continue. Now we have our username again, and then as we erase and change focus, nothing really happens. And then we'll see even down here it's going to throw some exceptions in our console. Now back here to our XAML, what we want to do is within the binding, we want to get the validates on exceptions, and we want to set this to true. And then we also want to update the source trigger to property changed, so we don't have to click the button to update it. And now when we run the application, as we type and then as we erase, we see that it's going to highlight our text box here with a thin red border. And then as we enter a character, it'll go away, and then as we remove it, it'll be there as well. So that's one way we can go about it. We can also go next over here to our validation by the DataErrorInfo interface. Now over here in our DataErrorInfo, we have pretty much the same setup here, just a username and a button. And then we're going to go to our registration view model real quick. And then in this view model, what we want to do is we want to get the IDataErrorInfo interface here, control period, and enter in the using statement for component model. And then we can hit control period again to implement the interface. Now the first thing we'll notice here is we have a little public string here error. This we're actually not really going to use, and WPF won't call this. So we're just going to get and return null. and then push this up here. Next, we're going to have this indexer here. In this, we're just going to erase the throw implemented not implemented exception, and we're going to rename this here to just name. Now what this does is provides a property to evaluate. So if we have an error, we want to provide an error message or return one, and if no error occurs, then we just want to return null. So we're going to set up a get accessor here. Just going to create a string here called result and initially set it to null. Next, we're going to do a switch, and we're going to pass it the name that we're given. And in this case, if the case is username, so that's the name of the property that we're going to evaluate. Then we're going to call an if statement here like we did before. We're going to do a string is null or white space name, or rather not name, the actual property we want to check, username. Then we want the result to equal username cannot be empty. And we want to do else if username length is less than 5. So if our username is less than 5 characters, then we want the result to equal username must be a minimum of 5 characters. And then we just want to call a break. Now, of course, we're still going to have an error because if none of these cases exist, then we still need to return something. And we'll just return the result, because if it doesn't hit anything, it'll then return null, indicating no error. So next we want to go over here to our Solution Explorer, go to our main window, go down to our XAML, and we're going to do something similar. We're going to get the text property, of course. We're going to do binding to the username. But now when we do, not the update yet, when we do validates, instead of validates on exceptions, we're going to do validates on data errors. And we're going to set this to true. And then, of course, now do our update source trigger to property changed. So now when we run our application, we see by default here, it is red. And then even as we type a character, it's still red. This is going to happen until we get to 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 characters here. Now it'll go away. Now basically what you may be thinking is it feels like we did a little more work here than the other one, and they both do the same thing. Well, now we're going to do something a little extra to the view model we created. So now here in our view model, we are returning multiple results, but this really doesn't do any help because all we really have is a red box. So there's really no point in even returning any kind of error message. So what we're going to do next is up above here, we're going to create a public dictionary composed of a string key and a string value. And we're going to call this error collection. And we're going to do a get private set. And just for now, we're just going to by default instantiate it so it's not null. Now next down here, after our switch, let me scroll down a little more. After our switch, we want to do if, we want to get our error collection here. If it contains a key for the property that we're checking, then we want to go to the error collection name, and we want to set this to the new result that we have. And we want to do an else if, because remember, we may not always be throwing an error, so we can do result equals null, or rather does not equal null, which means we do not have the key, but we do have error. Then we're going to add to our error collection here the name and the result. And now because our error collection has been updated, we want to do an on property changed error collection. So now what we're doing is creating a dictionary for certain errors that we're going to have. And the reason we're going to do this is because now over here in our main window, going to go down here to our XAML, and next what we're going to do is we're going to go to the tooltip property, going to do binding, error collection, which may not show up in IntelliSense just yet. And we want to get the key username. So now here, when we hover over our text box, we see we get a tooltip saying the username cannot be empty. But then as we add in a character here, and we go over it, the tooltip will change to the username must be a minimum of 5 characters. Now the next project we want to work on here is go over to our validation by custom. And again, we have the same layout as before. And now in this case, we're actually not going to really need to touch our view model at all. We're going to go over here to our project and we're going to add a new class. And we're going to name this new class here minimum character rule, and add. And then now here in our class, we're going to make this, of course, public. We then want to derive from validation rule, add in the namespace of System.Windows controls. And then in here, we're going to have a public integer. This will be called minimum characters, so we can set how many characters are limited. And we're just going to do a get set, because we will be binding to this, or rather setting this in our XAML. And then we want to go to override, and we want to find the override for validate. In this case, we'll just do the parameters with object and culture info. And then here I'm just going to create a string. We're just going to call it char string. You can give it a better name if you'd like. We're going to get the value as a string, and then we're going to check the char string here for a length and see if this length is less than the minimum characters. And then if it is, we're going to return a validation result. But actually here we're forgetting our new keyword, so a new validation result. I'm going to do false because it is not valid. And then we're just going to do a string here and use at least. We're going to put in our minimum characters here and say characters. Then if it doesn't hit this, then we're going to return a new validation result. In this case it'll be true, so it is valid. And then we need null. We'll just use null for the error content. So now if we go over here to our main window and we go down to our XAML and we go down here to our text box, we're going to do something a little different here. Just going to have opening and closing tags for our text box. We're going to access the text box.text. And then in here we're going to set up a binding. The path will be to our data context, which is the view model. So the path will be to the username property. We want to set the validates on errors, on data errors, to true. And then update the source trigger to property change. And we'll close that off. And now what we're going to do is we're going to access binding, validation rules. And then we're just going to go to our local XML namespace here, and we're going to find our minimum character rule. Now if you remember, we made a property in here as well. So we'll go to minimum characters and we'll set this to 5. Now when we run our application, we won't have an error because we didn't set up a rule for the username not being allowed to be empty. But then as we type here, we see that we're still going to have an error. Now we didn't set up an error message in here, but we could. And now if we just do 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we get to our 5th character here, we no longer have an error. Now I bet by now you're wondering, well, I actually want to display a message. I don't want to use a tooltip. I don't just want a red box. I actually want to display some kind of red error message to the user on the control. Well, luckily we can actually set up an error template here. So we're going to go over here to our app.xaml, and in here we're going to set up a control template, and we're going to give it a key, and we'll just call it error template. We want to, of course, give it a border because we're going to override the error template. So by default it'll give a red border, but now since we're going to override it, we need to set a new one. and we'll give it a border brush. I'll say orange red, and I'll give it a border thickness of 2, and we'll open that up, and then we'll just do a simple grid here, no special properties to it. Now what we do need is an adorned element placeholder. This indicates where the original content will be placed, so we're just going to keep that there. But then next, what we want to do is a text block. We want to do text, and this text block is going to be our error message. We want to do binding, and we're going to do an array indexer of 0 and .error content. Now when we override the error template, it's naturally going to have an error content. It's also going to have a collection. Now what this 0 here indicates is that we just want to return the message of the first error that we have. We don't want to display all of them, we just want to let them know what the first error is. We then want the foreground here to be like the border, orange red. We then want to do, let's say, a vertical alignment in the center, and then a horizontal alignment to the right, so the error message will be in the center right of the text box. And then we want to push it away a little bit, so we're going to give it a little margin from the right here of 4, and then close off. And now when we go over here to our main window, we go down to our XAML, go up here to our text box, and we want to get the validation.error template, and we're going to give it the static resource here of the error template we created. Now when we run our application, as we type here, we'll see that we'll actually here get an error template, and we set it so the user, whoops, must have misspelled that, but you get the point. The user must have at least 5 characters. So then as we type, we're still going to get that error, and then of course when we meet the validation, it'll go away and then come back. And you can also use this for all the other validation methods that we used as well. Now because I want to reuse this and we're going to move on, I'm going to copy and paste this control template here. I'm going to go over to our validation by annotations. We'll open up that app.xaml real quick, and we'll put in our control template again just so we can reuse it. And now we want to open up our main window and our registration view model. And now in this case, we're just going to jump right to our registration view model. But actually, there's one thing we got to do. To use the data annotations, we actually have to add in a reference here. So we'll add references. Then here in our assemblies, as we have a whole list, we're just going to type in annotations, and then we'll find here the reference for the System.ComponentModel data annotations. We want to tick that and then click OK. Close our references now and go back over here to our registration view model. And now the first thing we're going to do is over our property here, we're going to get a required attribute here. We're going to have to add in, of course, the reference that we just created. And what the required attribute indicates is that the property's value cannot be null or empty. If you guys are familiar with ASP.NET, you've probably used these. And then in here, we're going to set the error message here, and we're just going to say must not be empty. And now we also want to limit the character rule, and we can get another data annotation that we have called string length, but it limits the maximum and minimum characters here. I'll do 50, and we'll set the minimum length here to 5, and then we'll get the error message here. Must be at least 5 characters. Now by default, this isn't just going to work. We actually have to use the component model data annotations validate property. So scrolling down here, we want to do a, say, public, or say private void, call it validate property. We'll take a type of t. Then t, of course, will be the value, and string name. Then here we're going to call the validator dot validate property, and we're going to pass it, of course, the value here. So this is what we're going to be validating. And then we'll create a new validation context. This is the object instance in which the object exists. The rest we can just do null. And then within the validation context, we want to set the member name property here to the name. And of course, add a semicolon at the end. And actually, these always screw me up. We don't need one there. So now if we go over here, we're going to go over to our main window, go down to our XAML, and then here in our text box, we're going to get the text property. Of course, going to bind to the username. In this case, we're going to do a validates on exceptions to true. We're then going to update the source trigger here to property change like we always have. And then, of course, we want to access the validation error template and give it the error template we created for the last project. And now when we run the application, we see as we enter in characters here, we're not really getting anything. And as we remove it, we're still not. Now the reason we're of course not getting an error is we actually never called the validate property that we just created. So sorry to you guys who were probably yelling at me while you were watching the video and saw me skip over it. So then here we're just going to pass, of course, the value and then the username. That's the name of the property. We see that as we enter character, we are going to get an error real quick. Go to our exception settings. We'll break when this exception type is user unhandled. We'll hit continue so we won't get that anymore. And then now as we enter, we'll see it'll go away and come back. So guys, that's really it for the data validation in WPF. I hope you enjoyed. Like, comment, subscribe. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. And tell me which method you think you would prefer. I personally think I like the annotations. But anyways guys, thanks for watching.